Make that big boss less special. It ain't no game, but they saying welcome to the second level. Second level. Second level, baby. Second level.
Hey, everybody. Thank you so much for coming on out. It is my pleasure to introduce the CEO and head writer of Brunette Games, Lisa Brunette.
Thank you, James. It's really impressive to be the CEO of a company of one. So I'm gonna start actually with a story. I want you to think back 25 years ago. Some of you may not have even been born, but you can just imagine it in your minds. St. Louis University. I was a student here. I had a group of people who met at lunch every day here in Bush Center when it didn't look as swanky as this. And we would debate politics and philosophy, and we thought we were super brilliant. We would meet and discuss these like high-flown ideals. One of us was me, obviously. The other three were a libertarian anarchist, a seminarian studying for the priesthood, and a Venezuelan anti-socialist who had a real grudge against Cesar Chavez. So it was an interesting mix of people from very different perspectives. I had actually started SLU's pro-choice organization. So that's where I was coming from. So we would meet pretty regularly. And then one day, Miguel, the Venezuelan, didn't show up. And we felt his absence, the way you feel, a friend, you know, when you have this kind of interaction and you're all debating these things, and it feels life and death when you're in school like that, and you're learning and trying on these ideas and questions for the first time. And so we're like, became a mystery. Where's Miguel? Where did he go? Next day he wasn't there either. And each day he didn't show up, it became more of a heightened thing. And then finally we found him in the basement here, Bush Center, playing a card game. We're like, how is this possible? He left our Lyceum, our Greek Lyceum, for a card game? Why? It's so horrible to think of this. So we convinced him to come back because it just wasn't the same without the anti-socialist Venezuelan. You can imagine what he contributed to the conversation. So he's sitting there talking with us, and we can tell he's distracted. It just wasn't the same Miguel. This card game had just captured his imagination. So can you even tell me what the card game was? 25 years ago, 1993. What's that? Yeah. It was Magic the Gathering. So this is from the original set. Female artist, by the way, just thought I'd point that out. The reason I decided to start with story is, did you feel that spark? Right? If I say, let me tell you a story, your ears perk up, right? So I want you to think about that through this talk. A little bit about me. I have more than a decade in games. That is me. I can sometimes do a headstand against a wall. 15 years as a published writer, 10 years as a teacher, 40 years as an overachiever. There was recently a bidding war for my services, and even though that's true, I still fear economic hardship, which is why I almost constantly sell my services. Hopefully, I won't do that to you through this talk. Last thing you should know about me is that no matter what you heard at the Women in Games panel yesterday, the true reason my hair is this color should be obvious to you. I'm a Targaryen, right? Okay, so this is interactive, which means we'll interact, and some of us interacted before the talk began, which was cool. I would like you to think about, why does story matter? So there's a reason you came to this talk. Maybe some of you are vehemently against all story in games, which is possible. It's a position I have come across. And you came here to test that, which is yay for you. But I'm going to assume most of you like story in games. So I want you to think about the games you like to play. What's your favorite game, maybe? And imagine a game without the story. If we just gutted the story out, what does that do? And so how do you answer this question? Why does story matter? I'm going to call on people if I don't get hands. Yeah. Okay. All right, so she says, if you take the story out, you lose the motivation to play the game. Take the impetus out. How many people agree with that? Okay, so story is somehow setting that up or can help. When I was working on lots and lots of games at a time, at a publisher, we would always use the phrase, the story reason. The story reason for that thing you have to go now and do. Okay, yeah. Nice. He says it helps you connect with the character emotionally. Otherwise, they're just a bunch of NPCs hanging around. They fill up the world nicely. They provide, in some games, reasons to kill. But, and reasons to kill, the reason part of that, right? So there's this connection to characters, and I'm going to talk about that later, too. What else? Yeah.
Sometimes it's the only thing that matters. I mean, anybody does anything is because of stories. People, the reason you want to be a policeman, a fireman, an EMT, whatever, a knight slaying a dragon, is because you heard stories.
Right.
Story would drive you to do a certain thing or to take a certain action, take a certain stance, or explore a certain idea.
Nice. So he said very eloquently that the reason you become these things, fireman, policeman, whatever, that's not even the peace way to say that, police officer, I don't think you said that, I did that, is because something planted that idea in your head, or there was some backstory. We all have backstories. We all have narratives driving our decisions, whether we're aware of them or not. Yeah. And discovering that is an exciting part of the game. And he said at the beginning, sometimes it's the only thing that matters. Yeah. Right. Yeah, and I met Sebastian earlier. He has a game in the expo hall, some of you may have played, called Chroma, and we talked a little bit about his tutorial and whether he should have characters in there with that. And I said, I would resist that because your game is very abstract. And so you're right. Some people will come to me and say, Tetris does not need a story. So, and this is not why does story matter all the time in every game without fail. It's why does story matter when it is in a game, when it's done well, when it has a reason to be there, when it's supporting the gameplay. I could go on. Okay, so let's think about those things. If this were a scientific exploration, the first step was what we just did, which is to get all of our ideas out there. Our theories, even our assumptions, we're just brainstorming, which you all did very well. Next step would be, well, what have the experts said? So this is a science writer, professor, who's been published in Scientific American and New York Times and other places, and he wrote a book called The Storytelling Animal, How Stories Make Us Human. I love this quote. Human minds yield helplessly to the suction of story. We just can't resist the gravity of alternate worlds. We just can't resist the gravity of alternate worlds. For how many of you has this been true at some point? Yeah, I think everyone raised their hand, even Sebastian, whose game has no story. Actually, I think your game does have a story. We'll have to talk about that. Yeah, I love this. I love this. That suction I will sometimes talk about with my clients, like, there's no suction pulling me back to your game because you don't have a story, you just have words, something like that. Next thing would be to look at data. So this is the Entertainment Software Association. They keep this stat every year. I've been tracking it since 2012. Story, interesting story premise, is always in the top 5 and usually in the top 3. So this is reasons that people purchase games. So we know then that players will go and buy a game in large part based on its story. Certainly it's a game, so graphics are very important, the most important. That's the thing that distinguishes it from a book, really. And then price, these days, price is always a huge consideration, but interesting story premise. By the way, just as an aside, if you look at the other 3, now you see why Hollywood is regurgitating franchises from the past. There's a market for it, or maybe they're creating the market, but that's a topic for another day. All right, so I spent 5 years at a publisher called Big Fish. If you haven't heard of them, or maybe you will have recognized the splash screen, which James is going to cue now. How many people recognize that? Raise your hands. That's actually more than I thought. All right, so at Big Fish, let's go. It's letting me advance, James. There we go. At Big Fish, in 2002, the very first game that the company made, which at the time I think the company was 3 people, was Mahjong. So what happened was the founder, Paul Thielen, noticed that in the market there were no games for women like his mother. None. No video games for women like his mother. So he knew she liked to play Mahjong, so he's like, well, let's do a Mahjong game. So not really a story in this. But they wanted to build out their offerings, so they came up with this idea of using I Spy, which was really popular in this country in newspapers and magazines for many, many years. And so if you're looking at that demographic of women over 40, hey, here's something else. Mahjong worked really well for us. Now let's try this hidden object games. And the first ones looked like this. They were just scene after scene of hidden objects, which was totally fine, but players wanted more. The evolution over time was toward greater narrative. And it's actually borrowing quite a bit from the text adventures of the 70s and 80s, the early days of video games in this country, well, worldwide. So you see that coming in, even though they're very linear and they don't do the branching and some of the other things that hardcore traditional games have done. The evolution was definitely toward more story. And there was a market reason for that as well, because players wanted more than just those scenes. And originally the storyline was in a journal, so you get a lot of text on screen, and that was interesting itself, but not great for this interactive visual medium of games. So they started to look more like this, and you can go ahead and cue that video.
A cryptic invitation sparks a chain of events that turns the pages of history. It's every explorer's greatest dream. Journey across the globe from Belgium and France to the far corners of India. There, ancient mysteries and a centuries-old artifact await to be discovered. What happens when the most beautiful object in the world holds humankind's greatest power? The secrets hidden within the Hope Diamond.
So, super fun project to work on with the Smithsonian. But you see full cinematic cutscenes. The expectation of the story was really high, really well done cutscenes, not getting skipped by players. I can't tell you too much or I'd have to kill you, but we had a proprietary scoring method that we would use on all games at various points in their development process, and it told us that story made games score higher, games with higher scores sold better. So there you have it, some data. Here's another example, a little bit more edgy. This was the in-house studio, which could afford to take more risks than some of the small studios that depended on their royalty payments to live.
Isn't she lovely, detective?
We must go away before it is too late.
So that one verges more into horror a bit. Sorry, that one verges more into horror a bit, kind of creepy, fun game. All right, so this is the super interactive portion. If you have pen and paper, great. If you don't, use a laptop or your iPad. If you don't have that, what I usually told my students when I was teaching is grab your phone and start typing away in your notes section. Or you can just visualize this. I like options and choices, so we're going to design a game story, and you have these two options. Either take a game you've developed or played that has little to no story, come up with an idea for a story at its core. That can be one you've worked on or one you've played, it doesn't really matter. Take a game with a bad story and give it a good one. So either option. Decide. Any questions? Has everyone picked his or her option or their option? Anyone still need this slide up? Because this is going to be a timed event. So I'm going to have James cue it unless someone needs another moment. Okay. No, you got it? Okay. James, go. Sorry, 10 minutes. You know, when the fuse blows up the bomb. That was kind of obnoxious, wasn't it? Thanks for participating in that. I hope it wasn't excruciatingly long for you. I love those beautiful moments when writers are writing in a room together and they're all very quiet. We don't get very much quiet anymore. And you all participated very well by not having, your phones going off or anything. So it was this blissful 10 minutes of quiet, and I looked down, and I hope what I saw, was that people got really carried away in their imaginations and kind of like lose space. You felt the suction that Gottschalk was talking about of your own story, your own imagination. Such a beautiful thing. Would anyone like to share something? Yeah.
So the one that I picked was a really old game. It was called Space Cadet Pinball.
Okay, Space Cadet Pinball. You got some nods. Okay.
And the story that I built for it, just out of nothing, was that you are a fighter pilot who gets separated from your unit in space, and you basically get picked up by these space pirates. They jack your ship and they jack your stuff, and they're like, all right, you're basically free to go. Or, if you want to get your stuff back, you can either give us like a certain amount of money, or you can get certain things to trade. So from there, you go on certain missions, and you can actually choose different things that you want to do. And depending on what your choice is, that'll make the games of pinball that you play easier or harder. Maybe it's to get a certain amount of points in a certain amount of time, but I also wanted them to sort of be like morally questionable things, like the thing that seems right and the better thing to do in that situation becomes harder. Maybe you have to get a lot more points, or maybe you don't get as many chances and different things like that.
Nice. So maybe people in the back didn't hear, but he had set up this whole situation. He used something really important to all storytelling, and that was that it began with a conflict. So these space pirates pick you up, and then you're given a choice. So super important for games, player agency and the choice of how to go about solving this problem that's been put before you. And your two choices had a moral element, and they were Tony and...
I mean, from that point, you're either like free to go and you can go on your way, and I guess try to go back to the army, but your ship, your stuff is gone, or you can choose to work for them and go on different missions, and you'll have to acquire either certain amounts of money to pay straight for your stuff, or certain amounts of things that the pirates want that they don't have.
Okay, so the two choices both have a sense of possible loss or gain. So one, you just let the pirates have all your stuff and you go on your way, but you lost your ship and all of your supplies. The other is you work with the pirates and maybe compromise in some way, your integrity or your independence, certainly something else. Nicely done. Thank you. Anyone else? Probably have maybe time for one more. I wish we could do this all day. I think Melanie had your hand up. Yeah. Great idea. Just like you're an overachiever. Let me pick something that no one thinks a story can go into.
But I kind of, in a Papers, Please kind of way, of the card suits are kind of like different family members that are displaced due to some war, and you're kind of set to try to put the families back together, and maybe some of the cards are like liars, they want to like elevate their status to another family, or some people are dealing with like PTSD or memory loss, and you have to figure out what suit they are while you're trying to like delve into the family histories of all
Yeah.
to figure out who needs to go where.
That's awesome. So you said you use Papers, Please as your model, and the last speaker actually had used that as one of her models too for some of the development that she was doing. How many people saw that? How many people played Papers, Please? Yeah, so that's a great idea. I work on casual games, and so solitaire would be right in there, and I've seen a lot of solitaire-ish things done, but not that, so let's make it. Awesome, thank you. Okay, so when I'm working with clients, I tend to break down, this question, what makes a game story work? Because now you've done one, and we all kind of, for the most part, agree that story in games be good, but there can be badly done stories in games, and that's a lot of times why story gets a bad rap with some people, because they think it's this thing that comes in and mucks up the game in some way. So I break it down into, we talked about conflict, but there's also mystery, and not just genre, detective story, but a sense of something to investigate, something to solve, some mystery driving you to discovery. And then lastly, connection. And someone actually mentioned this earlier when we were talking about why does story matter. That idea of, I think you did, the connection of characters. And so a big open world is kind of a problem in games. Like, that's why we're investing so much time in NPC creation, is that we want that connection. And then James, if you'll cue this. So I want you to watch this and kind of pick out conflict, mystery, and connection. You can shout it out if you feel really so moved,
Hey,
or just note it.
you know how to pick a lock, right?
No. Why would you say that?
Well, you're, urban?
Oh, you
Microaggression and racism. So that's a type of connection, a type of disconnection.
Crazy shit just comes out of my mouth sometimes. Sorry.
We'll see, Clementine.
What's this thing?
Daddy said it's called a salt lick. Yeah, but don't lick it. It's gross.
Did you lick it?
I don't know.
You need to know how to protect yourself.
Like hiding or running away? Got it.
I mean, with one of these. Not so scary, huh?
Nuh-uh.
This is a nice way to handle both the conflict of how is this girl going to protect herself and the connection of how is this guy going to teach her how to do
have
it.
noise in them. Like,
You'll get used to it. So you're probably not gonna like this.
oh no. What happened?
Nothing. We have to talk about your hair. It's not safe.
That's not nice.
What?
Are you saying it smells?
No.
'Cause it does. Kinda. Do you know how to do this?
Nope. No idea. I'm not much of a stylist, you know?
I'm going to look like a boy.
But think how much safer you'll be.
I'd rather be dead.
Shush now. You picked a lock, which actually might work now that we have the
I
time.
think I opened it.
For real?
I think so.
Well, I'll be damned.
Entering a house, always a great mystery. What's in there, especially in this game?
Let's go. Be careful.
I'm supposed to tell you that.
All right, so think about this as you're making your own games and using that as a model. Hello. Yeah, it's stuck again, James. There we go. I'm going to break out that CMC acronym for you using Matchington Mansion, which is a game that I helped develop. I designed the story for this game, and it came on the scene last fall, stealing significant market share in the match 3 space away from heavy hitters like King and Playrix, if you know the business at all. It's got a builder match 3 narrative sort of element hybrid in it. And I think it's a good one to talk about story because match 3 games are not what people think of when you think of narrative games. I can look at Candy Crush and tell you there are narrative tropes in there that they're using very effectively, but yeah, it's not coming out like The Walking Dead as a narrative game. So I'm using this picture instead of fighting because I think what happens in game development so often is that people assume that gameplay fighting is the conflict. And what's more important about why 2 people or 2 enemies are fighting, why 2 armies are fighting, is why. What led to the fight? So that's the part that I want to encourage you to think of when you're designing games. So here we created a problem to solve, and this is tied directly to the gameplay because this is the builder element. So you get a mansion from a woman you edited her work. She's a famous author. You were a New York editor, and so when she dies, she didn't have any children. She gives you the mansion. So you go and you find this mansion, and right away, here's the problem. Well, the doors are falling down, so obviously you're going to need to do something. But that wasn't enough for me. So I had them add the threat of a villain, and this is Rex Houston. He's a little bit, I will admit, cliche on the villain side, but for a genre and a team that had never done narrative games at all before, and players who were maybe not so used to it, this is a good, quick signal. And he was based on some figures around the time Trump got elected that inspired me. So he comes along and he threatens, because he's a relative of the woman who gave you the mansion. So he is a threat to take away the thing the game just gave you, right? So it's pretty effective. We further add a challenge because you want to protect the mansion from him. So he's there all the time, and he wants to actually raise the mansion and build a casino on the spot. So he's kind of like a doubly evil in that way. But he's not one-dimensional. You have later an opportunity to learn more about his backstory and his connection to the place. So we kept the threat alive in a way that also tied to features and gameplay. So you have this person who comes and delivers packages to you, and this first package is a flyer from one of Rex Houston's casinos. And so that's an opportunity to show that you're going to get things from other places in the game, but also keep that story alive. So you see what I'm doing there is always tying story and feature, story and gameplay. So it's not story by itself, like an extra unconnected, disconnected thing, which is when story is bad in games, when writers are like, oh, this is how I can make money as a writer, but don't really understand that this is a game and people came to play the game. And so you want to design those two things together, which is why I call myself a writer designer and not just a writer. There we go. That one went fast. So the second element is mystery, and like I said, it's not necessarily, this is not a detective game, obviously, but we give players something to investigate. So again, this is tied to the quest system and the act of building through the mansion. So instead of just, decorating, just here's a sofa, it's, there's this backstory about the woman who I've been editing all this time. I had no idea she had this secret illicit romance, and all these things happened in this mansion, and it's all tucked right because everyone's got skeletons in a closet. And so you get to investigate and find things as you go. You discover them through the gameplay again, so that those two things are very tied together. And as players, especially in this genre, really want to be rewarded. And this is one of the deepest rewards. You can get a bunch of stars, you can get a sofa, but if you get story information that comes to you from your action, that's much more meaningful. Lastly is that connection. So the way to do this, of course, is to delight players with friendly encounters. So the people that they're discovering in the games, the NPCs. And again, they're tied to features in the game. So this is Gia. She ends up being your gardener, but she also introduces the idea that this is not just a mansion, but also a garden, and that you'll be placing flowers and trees and things like that. So super exciting for players. But it doesn't have to be all super pleasant and happy all the time. I actually am trying to move casual games in a slightly more edgy, edgy is probably too strong, but move them in a more interesting place where we're taking more risks. And so here's this character that my collaborator came up with, Edna Downing. And she's this kind of Eeyore character, which I love, and she was so much fun to write because I had her writing bad poetry and bringing it to you and reciting it. And so it's, someone talked about poetry yesterday for that experimental. I'm like, it doesn't have to be experimental. You can tuck poetry in ways that are pretty straightforward, and Edna Downing is it. So she introduces the idea that you get to visit other mansions in your neighborhood too. So there's another reason for her to be there. All right. Oh, that was the last one. So who was I talking to about this? Oh, a couple of developers. I don't think they're in the room. They're probably at their table, but quirky. So I love quirk. There you are. Yeah, so quirky characters. The more quirky characters you can put in a game, in my opinion, the better. All right, so just to recap, we've got games benefit from this section of story. Now, because people sometimes misunderstand this is not me saying every game must have a story right now. I demand it. Some games are much better off without them. If you got an abstract puzzler, some other game like that, necessarily, I don't know, fighting game maybe. I was talking to those people yesterday, and they kind of want to do it, so. Data, game performance, and play testing feedback tell us stories can make games better. So, can they make every game better? Not necessarily. But in my experience, both anecdotally, looking at market performance, and then customer data tells me that most games can be better. In my experience, most games, I guess I can say that, in my experience, but I tend to play games that lend themselves well to narrative. So I gave you an acronym. I invented it, copyright, TM, trademark, Lisa Brunette, but you're free to use it. Conflict, mystery, connection, CMC. Oh, here, if you want to take pictures of that. So those are the takeaways. And we have time for Q&A. So I'm giving you my website because all the other social media links are easily found from there. I hope to hear from you. I have a newsletter that you can sign up for. You get one of my novels for free when you do. I cover games, and I'm trying to get more people to write for it too, so it won't just be 24/7 me. All right, any questions? What have you got? I was that thorough, I answered everything. Oh, okay, Sebastian. Mm-hmm. So that was a lot, but you made some really good points. So you're saying you kind of struggled with the exercise because he finds that and correct me if this is the wrong interpretation of what you said, but that it seems like it's more of instead of discovering the story as you go through the game, that the game is kind of generating the story? Yeah. That's what really well. Let me stop for a second. So he says the player is helping to make the story, which I think is absolutely key to this medium. So if you play the game Firewatch, you are helping to create the player character. And that happens in some of my games too, the way, especially the interactive novels with branching narrative. You have choices that you're making, and by making those choices, your stats change and also your character changes. So you're absolutely right. And I think that's a great point. But what was your question? Like, what do you want? I'm not sure I understand. No, that's okay. So can we use your game as an example? How many people have played Chroma over there? Okay, so a few people, great. So did you try to create a narrative for that exercise for your own, or did you use a different one? So you overachieved and did both options. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, ideally, you would want to design just like that, like the way you described, instead of my exercise where there's a game already existing and you're shoehorning. Unfortunately, though, a lot of times what I've had to do is exactly that is, okay, we decided we need a narrative, and we designed this game already, and we're pulling you in now. So add a narrative to this. I would rather see them generate together like that, okay, this is, and I think you could, like Melanie gave us a great example of Solitaire is one of the oldest games. It's not as old as Rochambeau, but practically, and that's a great exercise to do. It's very challenging as you experience, like, okay, here's this really game mechanic, like it's basic game. How do we add a story, and can it be done in a way that doesn't take away from and adds to? And I think you did a good job of that. Other question? Oh, we're out of time. I'm here if you want to talk. Sebastian's like, oh, I took all your time. Don't worry about it. I think everyone got a lot out of that. So thank you so much for participating. I really enjoyed all your contributions to this talk. Thank you.
It ain't no game, but they saying welcome to the second level.